It's been nearly 2 decades since the two brothers had spoke to each other. Although their wives and even their children occasionally communicate, the bitterness between them is evident. The root of the problem can be traced back to the youngest brother, who believed that the oldest was trying to take control of the family business. The tension finally reached boiling point, resulting in a nasty scene in the office that led one of the secretaries to quit the next day. The youngest brother moved to another state and started his own business, and the brothers last spoke a while ago. The problem began when he failed to show up and visit her when she was in the hospital for a hysterectomy. She figured that any clergy person worth their salt would have been there for a prayer. After the first year, she openly expressed dissatisfaction with him to her friends and her wardens. Now she's threatening to cut her pledge. Besides, she says, his salary is too high and he isn't a very good preacher either. Sensing her disapproval and knowing his mistake, he keeps his distance and secretly hopes she might move and find another church. The two girls had been close since college. They even looked a bit like sisters. Both had been popular, married wonderful husbands, and had 2 children each. However, the problem began when one of them said something offhand about the other's weight problem during a conversation, which led to hurt feelings. Slowly but surely, they started spending less time together. The phone stopped ringing in the late afternoons, and an impromptu dinner ceased. Eventually, they found new friends and became too busy to keep in touch. Now they exchange Christmas cards once a year, but that's about it. These are familiar scenarios. The dynamics in people may differ from situation to situation, but in essence, the bottom line is always the same. Unresolved hurt and anger eat away at precious relationships. This is the second Sunday in a row where the gospel lesson addresses forgiveness and reconciliation. Jesus taught that the subject was important. He thought it was so important that he talked about it a lot in his ministry. The subject is also part of a more significant issue of behavior within the Christian community, how we live in relationship to one another. It's part of this stewardship of self theme that will so dominate the lectionary for the next several weeks. In last Sunday's sermon, you heard that forgiveness is a complex and ongoing process that requires patience, empathy, and commitment to our well-being. And how, through this internal give and take, we find peace and healing in our relationships. Today, prompted by a question posed by Peter, Jesus takes his ethics a step further and gets right to the heart of what forgiveness is all about. During the first century, the Jewish law set a limit of 3 times for offering forgiveness to someone who had wronged you. After the 4th occurrence, you were no longer obliged to continue the relationship. Peter starts to understand Jesus' teaching and anticipates his response. He realizes that Jesus has a way of stretching the limits of the standard practice. It is there that he suggests more than twice what the law requires. 7 acts of forgiveness might be more appropriate in line with what he understood about Jesus and Jesus' teachings. However, Peter was way off the mark, because Jesus responds, not 7, but 77 times. This means that forgiveness cannot be qualified. There are no limits, no boundaries. Peter continues to play by the old rules while Jesus keeps moving the goalposts. The upshot of today's lessons is pretty straightforward, I think. Oh, if it could be as easy to do as it is to understand. Forgiveness is quite tricky for us to practice in our daily lives. So let me tell you why I think that is. First of all, harboring hurt and anger can be fun. Now, I don't mean fun like it's fun to hang out at Deep App. That's fun. Or even catch Wicked at the Deep Hack, which, well, I guess is fun too. But fun as in satisfying. Once in a town, there was a party held every year. However, one year, the day before the event, the vicar realized that he had unintentionally omitted the name of a very influential and wealthy lady from the invitation list. The lady held a lot of power in the parish. The vicar was very worried about the mistake, so he went to the matriarch's cottage to apologize profusely. Upon hearing the vicar's apology, the lady forgave him and said he need not worry anymore because there would be no party the next day anyway. Well, the vicar was surprised and asked why. The lady, with a sheepish grin, replied that she had prayed for rain, which would surely come. While harboring ill feelings can be satisfying, it's satisfying at the time. In the end, it's spiritually devastating to the soul. Frederick Buechner says of anger, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is the most enjoyable. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue that prospect of bitter confrontation still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you were given and the pain you were giving back. In many ways, it is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback, he says, is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. Forgiveness can be a challenging undertaking in our daily lives. One of the reasons for this is that it requires us to let go of control. The Greek term for forgiveness translates to letting go. Understandably, we may feel uneasy about relinquishing control. It can leave us vulnerable and exposed as though we're giving up power. Moreover, some people have a strong-willed determination to hold on to that pain, make forgiveness seem impossible, regardless of the cost to ourselves. It can be complicated for humans to forgive those who wronged us. However, as followers of Jesus, we are called to release our bitterness and anger and show compassion to those who have hurt us. Jesus shared a powerful story about a merciful king, illustrating how vital forgiveness is. This king forgave a debt of $1 million owed by one of his servants. But that same servant refused to forgive a debt of just 1 day's wage owed by one of his colleagues. Sadly, the servant was imprisoned because of his lack of empathy towards others. The story tells an interesting reflection from Jesus' perspective. For Jesus, is trying to help us to understand how human forgiveness compares to God's divine forgiveness. We are invited and warned to see our lives from the perspective of the great mercy and grace of our Creator bestowed upon us each and every day. And if we understand the nature of God's mercy in our lives, we will naturally extend limitless forgiveness to others without worrying about counting the number of times we forgive. God has forgiven us for our actions and our inactions, and we are asked to forgive others in the same way. There is much at stake here this morning. Not only is our willingness to forgive others the action that holds any believing community together, any parish, but it's also how God seeks to redeem the entire world. Each act of forgiveness mends a piece of creation. To conclude this two-part sermon series on the theme of reconciliation, I want to leave you with a story once published in an op-ed section of the New York Times. The story is about the trial of a young member of a street gang written by a justice of the New York State Supreme Court who presided over the trial. The judge shares his experience and perspective on the trial in this article. He writes, "Throughout his criminal trial, the defendant's deadly stare never varied. It was his beacon of hate, as if warning everyone to stay away. The young man in my courtroom in Brooklyn was charged with gunning down another young man execution style. The defendant was no stranger to the system, and when the jury returned a guilty verdict, it seemed as if his deadly gaze only increased in intensity. Every day for 2 weeks, the victim's family attended the court session. On the day of sentencing, the victim's mother and grandmother were allowed to address the court." The judge goes on to say, "Ordinarily, when the victims speak at sentencing, they choose not to speak to the defendant directly. On those occasions when they do, they usually express their repulsion at the defendant and his deed in virulent terms. When the victim's mother approached the assistant district attorney's table, she turned slowly towards the convicted killer. Looking into his hateful stare, she began to speak in muted tones. There was no primal call for revengeance or retribution. Instead, her message was distilled by days of endless grief. 'I have no bad feelings,' she said. 'I could never hate you.' For the first time, the defendant's eyes lost their laser force. Now, following the mother, the grandmother also looked directly into the defendant's eyes and spoke about her loss. She told him she was sorry he committed the crime because you're a nice-looking man. Her message was simple and straightforward. You broke the golden rule, loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind. You broke the law, loving your neighbor as yourself. I am your neighbor, she said. She continued, you have my address. If you want to write, I'll write you back. For 16 months, I tried to hate you, but I can't. The judge concludes, after the grandmother finished, I looked at the defendant. His head was hanging low. There was no more swagger. There was no more stare. The destructive and evil forces within him collapsed helplessly before this remarkable display of forgiveness. In light of all that preceded it, the sentence I imposed, the judge said, 37 years to life in prison, seemed insignificant. Peter asks, "How often shall I forgive?" Jesus told him. Jesus tells us, not 7 times, I tell you, 77 times. By forgiving others, we are enabling God to mend creation, to put the broken pieces back together, one person, one piece at a time. And that's a world I want to live in.